The farther back you look, the farther forward you are likely to see. Those were the famous words of Winston Churchill. My guest this evening is one of the world's most famous historians, who is often asked to talk about the future. I was privileged to be his host in Serbia 4 years ago, where he predicted, very much to the shock of the Belgrade public, that the Leave was going to carry the British referendum, as well as the victory of Donald Trump. Perhaps more famously, writing for the Wall Street Journal in 2011, he predicted that Greece was not going to leave the Eurozone, but that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union. Niall Ferguson is the senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. In his truly extraordinary academic career, he was teaching and holding various professorial posts at Cambridge, Oxford, London School of Economics, NYU, Harvard University, and Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's an author of 15 books, most of which have become global bestsellers. Once he was approached by Henry Kissinger with the proposal that he be the writer of his biography. Niall Ferguson turned him down at first, before accepting it later. I'm very honored that the biography of Henry Kissinger was translated into Serbian by the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, and we are eagerly awaiting the second volume of this book. You are watching the Corona Dialogues, the new series organized by the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, Southeast Europe's leading think tank. My guest tonight, as I said, is a dear friend, Niall Ferguson, joining me from Montana, US. Good evening, Niall, and how are you? Actually, good morning. It's a morning in Montana.
Morning in Montana, evening in Belgrade. Vuk, it's a pleasure to join you. Thanks for that generous introduction. Not all my predictions over the years have come true, but you did manage to pick a few of the better ones. You might have mentioned one I wrote back in January in my weekly column for the London Sunday Times, which was that the World Economic Forum was focusing altogether too much on climate change and not nearly enough on the coming pandemic. That I think was around January 22nd, and sure enough, that was a good call, because I think most people at Davos back in January were entirely missing the significance of what was happening in Wuhan.
So when you mention Davos, Davos is like it's like the same thing to say global elites, the top of the world, the most influential people in the world. They tend to go there. Is it possible that again the global elites have gotten it wrong? One can argue that that was a wrong call. They did not expect Brexit. They didn't expect Donald Trump, and now 4 years later, is it possible that they're not getting it again?
Oh, it's almost certain. In fact, I go to Davos not every year, but fairly regularly, to find out what the global elite is collectively thinking in order to assume the opposite will happen. You can see the pattern in their global risk report, which they publish annually. The global risk report 2020 was entirely dominated by climate change issues. If you go back to 2007, there's no mention of the possible global financial crisis. And so I think it's actually one of the curious phenomena of our time that elite groupthink is a great counterindicator. You can't go wrong betting on the opposite. I wonder why this is, and I have a theory which I'll try out on you, Vuk. I think it's because the people who go to Davos, which is a mix of executives of big corporations and political types, European, American, increasingly Asian, that group as a whole does not read enough history. And because they don't, they are not at all good at anticipating those events that come along every century or so to cause really large-scale global disruption. They're very bounded by their own experience. And because they've been successful, they're important to their own lifetime experience. But that never goes back far enough, unless maybe you're Henry Kissinger, to encompass the kind of really big disasters that come along in history on a fairly regular basis. It's not like pandemics are hard to predict. It's not like it's a big surprise that a highly networked world has been attacked by a contagious virus. If you're a historian, that's the kind of thing you expect, just as you expect large-scale conflicts to happen on a fairly regular basis, but not every decade. And I think that's a key problem that we confront around the world. Elites who have been very poorly educated in history and therefore don't get the probabilities right on events like pandemics or wars or financial crises.
So you mentioned history and the role of historians. So I'm going to ask you to think about a situation. Actually, consider writing a letter to a homologue of yours, one of the world's most famous historians, in 2050. And if you were to write a letter to him today, explaining what happened in the first few months of 2020, what would you write to your future colleague?
Dear son or grandson, as you sit down to write the history of the Annus Horribilis 2020, I would urge you to consider the following perspective. Pandemics, which occur historically with a fairly high frequency, but with considerable variation in their lethality, are moments of revelation. It's important to understand the virus in question always, but it's just as important to understand the social networks and the states that it attacks, because as it attacks big and large states, it reveals their strengths and weaknesses. All the big entities in the world, what we would have called empires in a previous generation, did very badly in their different ways. China, the People's Republic of China, went through the whole Chernobyl sequence of denial and cover-up that guaranteed that the outbreak in Wuhan would become a global pandemic. By the time they shut down Wuhan, the virus had traveled by air all over the world as well as all over China. The United States revealed its own structural weaknesses because despite an elaborate public bureaucracy for dealing with problems such as pandemics, despite vast numbers of reports and indeed statutes on biodefense, when it came to the crunch, the system failed. And a populist president contributed to that failure, but wasn't the decisive variable. The United States dithered, went through a complacency phase when it should have been acting preemptively, and then overreacted too late in mid-March in response actually to a British epidemiologist's report. Finally, the European Union revealed its own true nature in the face of the pandemic. In the immediate crisis, each nation sought its own protection. National borders were restored, and for a time, Germany, Austria, and other countries were in fact seeking to prevent the export of vital medical equipment to the most affected country, Italy. So these were revelations of the frailty of the big powers in the world, revealing, I think, in particular, the diseconomies of scale that a pandemic often causes. The countries that got it right, by contrast, were the small, nimble states like Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, and interestingly, Israel, which acted early because they had a heightened sense of their own insecurity, not just with respect to disease, but a whole range of threats. You might think of them as the city-states that got their act together, even as the great empires were ravaged by the plague. So my son or grandson, heir of the tradition of serious historical scholarship, if that tradition still exists in 50 years' time, try to think of it in those terms. And for heaven's sake, don't give too much of the space in your book to the models of epidemiologists.
That is absolutely fascinating answer, and I might add to this letter, and do not get confused by name when it comes to the people who made the whole big fuss, because it was also Niall Ferguson at the Imperial College who brought forward this report that seemed to have changed so many things in the United Kingdom, and brought people into a degree of perhaps not panic, but certainly a different course of action than it was taken until then. Now, I'm going to ask you. You said well, it was an overreaction in the United States, and did you mean the lockdowns? Did you mean the essential shutting down of large chunks of the economy? Perhaps not just in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. We're totally locked down in Serbia, or at least during large parts of the week. Do you think that these lockdowns were necessary, and how to get out of this situation? What is your view?
Well, let's first say a brief word about the other Niall Ferguson, an epidemiologist at King's at Imperial College London, whose March 16th paper caused a drastic change in policy not only in the United Kingdom but in the United States, because it projected that if nothing was done, 2.2 million Americans could conceivably die. What Niall Ferguson recommended in that report, which everybody should read because it's a historic document, was not just social distancing, but what he called suppression, which means in practice economic lockdown. And I think that it's already clear, A, that his assumed IFR, infection fatality rate, the percentage of people who die amongst those who get the virus, was too high. It was 0.9%. It is not going to be that high. I think it's much more likely to be closer to 0.3 or 0.4%. Because if it was a disease that could kill 2.2 million Americans, then you're talking about something as severe as the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, which killed a horrifyingly large proportion of the world's population, over 2%. And I think that's not really what we're dealing with here. Secondly, I think that the notion you had to do full economic lockdown was almost certainly flawed, because I think the economic costs of that policy almost certainly exceed the public health benefits. I think social distancing, which was happening anyway before anybody ordered it, has been a much more effective response to the contagion than economic lockdown. And I think we'll pretty certainly realize that as time passes. There's a new paper that I just read this morning by some Chinese researchers that shows that actually what really worked in the other provinces of China, which successfully contained the pandemic after it spread from Hubei, wasn't actually travel bans. It was a whole series of measures designed to ensure social distancing. And that if you look at the economic lockdown, the closure of large parts of the economy, those were much less impactful than, for example, restrictions on any form of crowded activity. It's the closure of restaurants and bars. It's the cancellation of public events. It's mask wearing. It's rules that reduce crowding in public transport. Those are the things that really are effective. Ceasing manufacturing, I don't think has had nearly as big an impact on reducing the reproduction number of the disease. So when I say that we overreacted, what I mean to say is that first, when we should have overreacted in January, February, we didn't do anything like enough. In fact, we did barely anything. And then when it was too late and the disease had established itself in really most major countries, then we learnt the wrong lesson from China. We looked at Hubei, and they had locked down Hubei without question. We said, well, we have to do that. We need to be Hubei. And we were looking at the wrong China, because the country that got this right was not the People's Republic of China. It was the Republic of China, Taiwan. And Taiwan did not do economic lockdowns. Taiwan did the things that you should do in a case like this: early detection through testing, and then contact tracing, so that anybody who tested positive had their social network rapidly identified and quarantined. Taiwan has had a trivial number of fatalities, despite being right next door to the People's Republic of China. So we, I think, learned the lesson from the wrong China, and we missed what we should have been doing, which, as I said, would have avoided the economic lockdown. Of course, social distancing had to happen. You can't avoid a major economic shock in a crisis like this, because you've got to cancel a whole bunch of activities that would transmit the virus rapidly. But the blunt instrument of just shutting your economy down, which is what's happened in New York and in California and other states, as well as in most of Europe, that has all kinds of massive unintended consequences. We have created, through lockdown orders, the biggest economic crisis, arguably since the 1930s. It could even end up matching the Great Depression. And I don't think the public health benefit was commensurate with that shock.
That is absolutely fascinating, what you just say, and your observation on like the wrong models that were applied here in Serbia. By the way, we did follow the Wuhan example, actually quite to the letter. But you did say something very, very scary right now, that we are looking into the biggest economic crisis perhaps since the Great Depression. So do you think that this is avoidable at all by all these measures like stimuli packages that were thrown at the US and European economies? Is that going to help this massive stimuli, which quite interestingly are only happening in US and Europe? For instance, China hasn't done it. Was this the right way to go?
Well, first, let's not use the word stimulus. It's not really appropriate here. These are relief measures designed to compensate for the shutdown of the economy. And whether you're giving businesses loans that you'll probably forgive, or simply sending checks through the mail to ordinary unemployed citizens, this is not stimulus. You can't stimulate an economy that you've consciously shut down, any more than you can drive off in a car that has had two wheels removed. I mean, you can step on the gas, but you won't go anywhere. So these are relief measures, and they were certainly appropriate if you accept that the lockdowns were appropriate. But as I said, I'm skeptical that we needed to use such a blunt instrument if the Taiwanese didn't need to, and indeed the South Koreans didn't need to. Why exactly did we decide that we were Hubei and not Taiwan? If we'd acted the way the Taiwanese did, early detection and early action, we needed to do this. I think if you ask a slightly different question, which is how long can this go on, the answer is not for much longer, because you think about what's happened. Basically, a bunch of businesses are on life support in the hope that they'll be able to resume business soon and rehire the workers that they furloughed. And there really isn't much time left before those businesses die. The life support doesn't keep going indefinitely. At some point, you just have to shut down and the jobs are gone. So this is a necessarily temporary measure. It's creating, of course, a whole bunch of future problems for policymakers. This is an enormous increase in public debt. The US deficit for 2020 is likely to be around 15% of gross domestic product, probably higher actually, given the shrinkage of GDP that we're seeing, which is an unprecedented number in peacetime. And pretty soon the federal debt will in fact be higher relative to GDP than it was at the end of World War II, which is a pretty staggering thought. The Federal Reserve balance sheet has expanded faster than it did at any point in the global financial crisis, absorbing all the new debt being issued. These are short-term relief measures, but the question is, how long can you carry on doing that? And again, I'd say the answer is not long. Unfortunately, because this is not a financial crisis, it's a pandemic with financial symptoms, nobody has really thought through the problem of the second wave. All the great pandemics in history have come in multiple waves. That was true of the Black Death. It was even true of the plague that struck the Athens of Pericles. It was true in 1918-19. It was true in 1957-58. And so our policy has been predicated on flattening one curve and then going back to normal. Well, there will be more than one curve, because as we go back to normal, the number of cases will rise, and so will the number of illnesses, and so will the number of fatalities. And the only question is when that will happen. Will it be very soon, or will it wait until later in the year? But I've absolutely no doubt that there'll be a second wave. And then what? Do we do it all again? Do we lock down again? I really hope we don't, because the right response, as I've said, is testing and contact tracing, the Taiwanese model. And what's really troubling to me at the moment is that I see countries, and particularly states in the United States, going back to quote unquote normal, trying to go back to normal without adequate testing or contact tracing in place. Whack-a-mole is a difficult game. I don't know if you've ever played whack-a-mole at a fun fair, but it's really, really hard to play blindfold. And blindfold whack-a-mole is what the United States is embarking on. And I find that a really troubling prospect.
Wow. Now let's now become an even more depressed, because I gotta ask you this, and this is about the geopolitics. The geopolitics of the world. I mean, the world wasn't really going in the right direction, at least from a perspective of somebody who's a multilateral like myself. There was less cooperation, more international competition and rivalry. People were even talking, and I'm talking about before the COVID-19 crisis, people were talking about a new Cold War emerging, the Cold War between America and China, first of all in the technological realm, and then spreading into all other spheres of the society. Now, with this crisis, do you think that that the Cold War between the United States and China is more or less likely? I know that in the past you famously wrote about Chimerica or Chimerica. What's the future of Chimerica in the post-COVID-19 world?
Chimerica is dead, but it was dead before the pandemic. I first used that word in early 2007 to try to describe what seemed like the economic fusion that had happened between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. But from the outset, the argument that I and my co-author Moritz Schullerich made was, this is unsustainable. This will blow up. And indeed, it was one of the causes of the financial crisis, because it was the flows of Chinese savings into US assets, the reserve accumulation policy of the People's Republic of China, that caused the property bubble to inflate in the United States. So Chimerica was never something that we celebrated. We always worried, correctly, that it was an unsustainable marriage between China and America. I think the marriage was in crisis from the financial crisis onwards, but it didn't die quite as quickly as we expected. In fact, it limped on really until around 2015, when I think yet another Chinese devaluation was the last straw. I see the election of Donald Trump as partly a backlash against Chimerica. He was the only candidate who was willing to go after China in 2016, and that was a crucial reason for his victory, because the American public had essentially seen through Chimerica and realized, as we'd said at the outset, that the benefits of Chimerica disproportionately went to China and not to ordinary Americans. I was one of those who last year argued that the Cold War had begun. In fact, I think I wrote a column on this subject more than a year ago. And I've argued consistently since last spring that Cold War II is A, inevitable, and B, good, which often takes people by surprise. By which I don't mean we should look forward to Cuban Missile Crises or wars in Indochina. No, this Cold War will be different in a bunch of respects. It will be like Cold War I at its core, a technological rivalry, a competition between two rival superpowers. And that rivalry extends far beyond the area of the trade war into, as you mentioned correctly, Vuk, into the tech war. It's a rivalry about semiconductors and China's ability to become independent in high-end semiconductors. It's a row about 5G. Will a Chinese company, Huawei, build the 5G networks of the world or not? It's a rivalry about digital currency. Will China lead the next financial revolution? It's an argument about artificial intelligence, about quantum computing. And this competition in all of these different domains will be the core of Cold War II. And as I said, it's been well underway since last year. The Chinese know this. No Chinese spokesman's ever contradicted me when I've said this. It's just that many Americans and even more Europeans are in denial about it because they think that somehow Chimerica can be put back together again. And I'm here to tell you that ain't going to happen. One of the revelations of the pandemic, I think, has been the true nature of the US-Chinese rivalry. And for many Europeans, it has come as a revelation. I think the UK, for example, is a country that is reassessing its relationship with China. Now that we see so clearly, A, the pathologies of the Chinese regime that caused this to become a pandemic because of the systematic lying and obfuscation that went on December and January as the virus spread, because I think people in Europe have been rather shocked by the cynicism with which the Chinese foreign ministry has promoted fake news about the origins of the virus. And I think there's also been a general sense that China's supposedly altruistic distribution of medical equipment was anything but altruistic and was part of a sort of propaganda initiative. So there's been a revelation for many people about the true nature of the Chinese system. And those people who can dream that magically China would liberalize if it was integrated into the global system, I think those people are coming out of their delusional dream. Talking of multilateralism, Vuk, it hasn't been a great pandemic for the World Health Organization, one of a number of important international institutions that has essentially sold out to China in a way that was really very disturbing in the crucial early phase of the pandemic, when I think the WHO basically connived at a Chinese cover-up. The problem is, and this is the key to this curious Cold War, that the revelation of America's problems has not exactly been edifying. The United States has revealed itself not only to have an incompetent president, Europeans already knew that, but also to have a highly defective administrative state. The deep state of legend turns out not even to be capable of doing what it says on the tin. When it says it has a biodefense strategy, it turns out not to have one, or at least not to have one that works. And I think for many Europeans, this is the problem about Cold War II. They now see pretty clearly the problem with China and the disadvantages that would lie ahead of us if China did become the dominant power in the world. But at the same time, they turn to the United States and they think, gee, that's the alternative, which nobody really thought in the late 1940s. When you looked between Stalin and Harry Truman, it was kind of a no-brainer. If you had the choice, you chose the United States. But I think a lot of people look at the choice between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and they think to themselves, is there an option C available? And of course, there's not.
But let me ask you, why do you say that this is a good thing, or did I hear you incorrectly? Why would the Cold War be a good thing?
Because with the challenge of China, without the recognition of rivalry, the United States will not do all that it needs to do. In the absence of an enemy, this country falls apart. Its divisions become chronic. Once there's an external foe, the United States performs better. It will allocate more resources to research and development. It will perhaps, there's always a chance, address the very profound problems in its own system of governance and its bloated federal government. The key here is that without an explicit Chinese challenge, the United States won't do the investment it needs to do in research in all the different domains I mentioned. The lesson of the first Cold War, which is often forgotten, is that its positive externalities in terms of research and development were enormous. One reason that we have a memory of a booming American economy in the 1950s and 1960s was precisely that, what Eisenhower called pejoratively the military-industrial complex, produced all kinds of spin-offs, which didn't happen in the Soviet Union because there was no private sector there to exploit the technological advances. But the conversation that we're having right now through the internet is only possible because the original internet, ARPANET, came out of an effort by the Pentagon to come up with a distributed communications network that would be resilient in the face of a nuclear war. And I could mention many other examples of this. It's impossible really to write the history of Silicon Valley and all that's come out of it without recognizing that it was initially stimulated by Defense Department research. So Cold War II has the similar quality. Just as in Cold War I, there was a race not only to build atomic and nuclear weapons, but also to get a man on the moon, or at least satellites to orbit the Earth. It was a race in a whole range of different domains beyond simple weaponry. So this Cold War will also be a technological race. And with China breathing down its neck, I can guarantee you the United States will run a lot faster in this race than if it felt itself to be part of a partnership with China.
And what about the European Union? We live in Europe. Serbia is not a member. We'll see what happens with the future of the enlargement process. Not too many optimists on that front. But what is European place in all this? What's your take? What is the future of the European Union in the aftermath of this crisis?
Well, a number of commentators have seized the opportunity to predict the disintegration of the EU. I think they were the same commentators who predicted that back in 2011. And I think we should be very wary about that prediction. That assumption that the whole thing's going to fall apart is very popular amongst British Eurosceptics. And each crisis that strikes the European Union gives them hope that it'll happen and they'll be vindicated. But I think we should be a little cautious. Yes, in the first phase of the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, the revelation was that it was sauve qui peut, for every man for himself. National borders went back up. Supplies of medical equipment were hoarded, and Italians were justifiably appalled at the lack of assistance they they received. But actually, within a relatively short space of time, the EU self-corrected. And we've seen, not only in the language of leaders like the French president Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, but also in actions, a shift in the right direction, which is towards some degree of fiscal integration and burden sharing, so that the most affected states, like Italy, can anticipate some kind of meaningful support from the less affected states of Northern Europe. So I think one needs to judge the European Union by action as well as by words. And I think there has been a recovery from a very dodgy moment back in the early phase of the crisis. I think if you think in my terms of Cold War II, you need to bear in mind that Europe is not just defined by the EU, it's also defined by NATO. And despite many predictions of its demise, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is still very much in business. And that matters, given that China's most dependable ally, if you ignore North Korea, is Russia. And Russia is and remains for the foreseeable future a meaningful threat to those recent NATO members, such as the Baltic states and other Central European countries. I think if you think about it in those terms, it is still a familiar landscape dating back to the late 1940s, a landscape in which the security of Central and Western Europe is inseparable from the American commitment. And I sense that relationship, although it's been much strained during the Trump presidency, has withstood that strain and will be, in fact, a dependable relationship in the event that President Putin decides to test out our commitment to our fellow NATO members. Last point I'll make, Vuk, let's not forget that in the tech war, the regulator of the internet, ex-China, is the European Union. Because the United States can't really figure out how to regulate the internet, I think mainly because of the power of Silicon Valley lobbyists in Congress, it's fallen to the European Union to devise a whole set of regulations around data protection, and also to start imposing some meaningful penalties on the big tech companies for monopolistic practices. So I don't think Europe's down, and it's certainly not out. It may even be that Europe can now move more effectively forward in the direction of a federal structure now that Britain is out. I mean, Brexit happened in the nick of time, actually, insofar as it's a concluded process, which of course it's not. But I think it was vital really for Europe's future to remove Britain from the EU, because ultimately Britain was semi out of it already. The minute that Britain declined ever to join the monetary union, Britain was a semi-detached member of the EU, and it consistently dragged its feet whenever there was any kind of move in the direction of further integration. Well, that problem's basically solved now, and Britain is going its own way. And I do think that it will be easier for Europe to take steps in the direction of fiscal integration as a result.
So my last question in this section for you, you mentioned Russia, and you talked about Russia as a threat, but you also talked about a new Cold War between the U.S. and China, and you also wrote of Henry Kissinger. So one of the most famous things that Henry Kissinger did in his life was to recommend to Richard Nixon that he does this great and unexpected move that he reaches out to the communist Beijing and drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic. He successfully done it. Now, can you imagine another American president in the future, this president or next president, or at some point in the future, trying to do an inverse Nixon/Kissinger, trying to go to Moscow and to get Moscow to drive a wedge between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic and get Russia, if you will, on the west side in this Cold War?
Many people have considered that possibility. In fact, I remember thinking after Donald Trump's election that this was a potential opportunity, given his strange sense of affinity with President Putin. But it hasn't happened, and I don't think it can happen. It's partly because there's so much suspicion of Russia in Congress. Remember, if Putin thought he would get any sanctions relief out of Donald Trump's election, he's been sorely appointed. But it's also because I think the Russians themselves, as long as Putin is president, will be absolutely convinced of the malignant intentions of the United States. And in that sense, I don't think that there is going to be a kind of president in Moscow moment when a future president, or maybe even this president, somehow magically changes the geometry of great power politics the way Nixon and Kissinger did in 71, 72. I think the relationship between Beijing and Moscow has only grown tighter in the last 4 years. And now I see ample evidence that Moscow's disinformation warfare playbook has been translated into Chinese and is being now used as the basis for Chinese strategy in Cold War II. So it feels to me very much like the early phase of Cold War I, when, if you remember, the newly created People's Republic of China from 1949 right the way through to the 50s was a very reliable puppet of Joseph Stalin and was indeed used by Moscow to wage the Korean War on Moscow's behalf. I think that the thing that's changed is that China's now the dominant partner, and Russia is very much mini-me. And as long as Russians are willing to tolerate what that means, which is, of course, that China begins to take over the traditional Russian backyard of Central Asia, then the relationship will endure. Sooner or later, I think it will fall apart, because historically it's anomalous. You know, the Russian-Chinese relationship is not historically one of amity. But if it falls apart, it will fall apart of its own accord, not because of anything that the United States does. And that I think means that US policy needs to focus instead on strengthening the traditional alliances with Europe and in Asia with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. We have a very good Cold War alliance system. It was always better than the Russian version, which relied on captive nations in the Warsaw Pact, and couldn't even keep Yugoslavia, as you yourself know, Vuk, inside the tent. The American alliance system was always much better, and miraculously it still exists. And really all Donald Trump's successor needs to do, because he's incapable of it, is remind American allies of what the benefits of an alliance with the United States are. And that should be quite easy, because it's actually pretty obvious.
Well, thank you very much. Now we are moving to the next section, which is called the Blitz section, where you are allowed to give only a binary answer. You're either going to go long or short. And here is the list. Number 1, bin Salman.
Short.
The Islamic Republic of Iran.
Short.
Emmanuel Macron.
Long.
Belt and Road.
Short.
The Republic of Catalonia.
Short.
Hong Kong.
Reluctantly short.
The United Nations.
Long.
The Roman Catholic Church.
Short.
Greta Thunberg.
Short.
Goldman Sachs.
Short.
Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Long.
The House of Windsor.
Long.
S-400 air defense system.
Long.
Novak Djokovic.
Short.
Thank you very much. The last answer was really great. All others were phenomenal. Thank you for that. Joking, of
Bosnia
course.
was the tricky one. Bosnia was the
It was
tricky one.
it was a tricky one indeed. It was a tricky one indeed. But I think I agree with you. Now we're going
Well, I
to
think you should always be long. That's at the bottom of the market, right? I mean, there's only one way for
yeah.
Bosnia to go. It can't be any further down.
Yeah. Well, now I'm going to ask you some fascinating questions that were collected through our social networks by members. Most of them are students. They're very interesting questions. So let's try and run through as many of them as possible. We have about 12 to 15 minutes left in this conversation. First question is from Serjan from Chachak. If you were asked by the G20 leaders to create a task force that would help you propose to them how to help the world not descend into abyss. And if the task force is to be comprised of 5 people, it could be thinkers, scientists, economists, anybody, to go to a retreat, say in Montana, and to your place in Montana to spend a month thinking it through and then proposing it to the G20, which 5 people would you take with you?
Great question, and I'll obviously upset at least half my friends by excluding them. But am I allowed to start with one of those thinkers whose approach to probability and risk has really stood out over the last 20 years? Nassim Taleb. I'd really want Nassim along to be part of the discussion. It's vital that we're interdisciplinary. And so if you're going to have an options trader turned philosopher, you also want a really serious physicist. I'll take Martin Rees, Lord Rees, the Queen's astronomer, whose famous bet, which Steven Pinker made the mistake of taking, was that there would be, before the end of 2020, at least one bio disaster that would kill 1 million people. We definitely want someone like Martin in the room. Third discipline that I think needs to be reflected is economics. And it's hard to choose from all the great economists out there, but I'd pick Ken Rogoff because more than anyone else in the field, he's shown that you have to apply history to understand financial problems. And I think Ken's recent commentary on the crisis we're in, that it could even be worse than the Great Depression, means that we need someone with his incredible brain in the room. I suppose that if you're going to try to make recommendations that are actionable, you need to have somebody with exceptional political skills. So I'd ask Angela Merkel if she could spare the time to come and help us rule out the politically impracticable. Would also be good to have her there, because then we wouldn't be accused of being an all-white, all-male cabal, which is the kind of accusation that one has to contend with these days. That just leaves one spot. And I'm going to disappoint Vuk, because I really wanted to ask you, Vuk, but there's one person who is really quite extraordinary in her understanding of the technological challenges of a networked world, and it's Taiwan's Minister without Portfolio, Audrey Tang, who's, I think, one of the reasons that Taiwan has got this crisis so very right. And though I've never met met Audrey Tang, I've read and heard amazing things about her, and the fact that she's transgender only adds to my political correctness at a time of
Oh, wow.
heightened sensitivity.
That is political correctness indeed. Now, well, thank you very much. It's a fascinating answer. Now I'm going to ask you a second question. This is from Ivo. He is from Zagreb. And the question is, now that a nasty pandemic can no longer be categorized as a black swan, talking about the future, what is a top black swan for the next 5 years, in your opinion?
Ivo, Nassim Taleb always complains that people ask him that question, whereas by definition you shouldn't be able to predict a
Shouldn't be
black
able to
swan. It's a contradiction in terms, that question, because black swans are supposed to be the things that lie outside your ability to reason probabilistically. Let me introduce a couple of other monsters or creatures to the menagerie. Dragon kings, which are very rare, very impactful events that you can predict. A pandemic is definitely a dragon king. But also, let's not forget grey rhinos, which are those very visible beasts charging towards you that you know full well are coming, but for some reason, maybe because they're grey, you don't quite see them until they trample you underfoot. I think it's easier to talk about dragon kings and to talk about grey rhinos because they are supposed to be predictable, unlike black swans. So I'll give you a couple. Struggling here to think outside of the World Economic Forum box of supposedly predictable risks. I'd say that we've become so dependent now on the internet under these extreme conditions. We already were pretty dependent, but it's got a lot more pronounced that a crisis in the actual functioning of the internet seems like a grey rhino, and it could happen just because of overload. I mean, if everybody's watching on Netflix and Zooming simultaneously, the capacity of the system starts to really be stretched, or it could come about because of a malicious attack. I'd say that's the thing that we should really be worrying about, because imagine the pandemic without the internet, and you're pretty quickly looking at a science fiction dystopia. I think that the other Dragon King grey rhino, but maybe more a grey rhino, is that there will be inevitably in the realm of fiscal and monetary policy. It seems to me either you end up at some point, maybe next year or the year after, with a jump up in inflation, or you end up back in the vortex of austerity. It's difficult to imagine that the world sustains the new and rapidly rising level of public debt and the monetization of that debt by central banks without one or other of those outcomes, and so that feels like another predictable problem that's not too far away.
Thank you. The question from Jovan from Vienna is, what is the future of big sports events like Soccer World Cup or World Games in the aftermath of COVID-19?
Jovan, I'm really glad you asked that question, because one of the worst features of the pandemic for me has been the abrupt termination of the Rugby Six Nations tournament and the English Premier League, which provide me with a regular and urgently needed source of distraction and entertainment. It's miserable, isn't it? Life without those sports, and in the US, we're baseball free at a time when the season should just be getting underway. It seems like a really big problem, even if sports is not quite as serious a subject as our Dragon Kings and grey rhinos. I have a solution, though. Clearly, the games can be played, and they don't need live audiences any more than you need live audience for television drama. And you say to yourself, but it won't be the same if if teams play in empty stadiums in silence, and you're absolutely right about that. But we have a solution to that problem from the realm of television. Do you remember how when situation comedies started without audiences, they had canned laughter? Well, I am absolutely sure we can do canned crowd noises. As long as the camera angles don't show the empty stadiums, they could even show fake crowds. We can simulate live soccer, and I actually would recommend that the sound of the crowd be played to the players so that they hear it, because we do play differently in sports when people are cheering, and that's a solvable problem. Finally, we'll be able to get back to live crowds at some point in the next 2 years. It's not that I have huge faith in a vaccine or even in therapies being found. I think this disease is a nastier one even than we yet realize, and it's going to be hard to come up with vaccines and therapies. I actually think that we're going to get to some kind of herd immunity, really more by accident than design, and that for young people, because COVID-19 really isn't desperately dangerous to young people, that will mean that going to football will once again be possible long before the great tradition dies out. We've had great disruptions to the game of association football in the past, not least world wars, and it's amazing how football survived those. So I'm pretty sure that an illness that disproportionately kills the elderly is not going to put a stop to an activity that basically involves the young.
Thank you. Now, very interesting question. Una from Sarajevo. My town has a particular place in the world history in the context of the beginning of the First World War. Can you imagine a world war in the 21st century? And could you describe a scenario that could lead to it?
Well, Una, thank you for that question. And can I convey my best wishes to the lovely town of Sarajevo, where I spent some happy weeks when I was working on my book, War of the World. It's a beautiful town, and it's had a rough time. I look forward to returning someday. I do, of course, imagine another world war. It's what I'm really predisposed to do, having studied both world wars and written on the Cold War and thought a great deal about how wars happen. I mean, wars are like pandemics, and indeed earthquakes. They're governed by power law distributions, not normally distributed. Really big wars statistically are hard to predict, but anybody who says there'll never be another one, and I'm talking about you, Steve Pinker, is ignoring the history, and indeed I think also the statistics on violent conflict. So I do think that a conflict is probable. Indeed, the whole point of Cold War II is that it has as a latent possibility Hot War III, just as Cold War I did. The point about Cold War I was that there was always the scenario that it would escalate into a hot war. That was what made it so nerve-wracking, the possibility of thermonuclear war. It hung over us right until the end of the Soviet Union. Now, Cold War II with China isn't likely to produce a nuclear war because China is completely outgunned in nuclear terms by the United States. So I don't think we're heading for that kind of a nightmare world where there's a sort of mushroom cloud waiting to appear on your horizon every day. I think it's more likely that Cold War II, if it shades into hot war, will shade into hot war in the realm of cyberspace first. That is to say, it'll start with information warfare. And the question is, what point does it really become hot war? The funny thing about cyber warfare is it's neither one thing nor the other. It's not Cold War because it's clearly not without its conflict. But it's not hot war if it's just bots on bots or viruses and malware. I think the critical issue, and I go back here to one of my grey rhinos, is at what point does cyber war become disruptive of physical infrastructure. Given how much is now controlled through the internet, in the Internet of Things, including power grids, medical systems, at what point does a cyber attack actually become a hot war because it's disruptive of the physical world? And I think we could reach that point really quite quickly. So my vision is certainly not a rerun of 1914. I don't think this starts with an assassination, least of all in Sarajevo. I think it's much more likely that World War III starts with an online disruption of service that translates into such serious disruption of the physical world that it invites retaliation of a non-cyber variety. And remember, the US has been committed now for some time to the doctrine that a cyber attack can be a pretext for non-cyber retaliation. That, I think, is how World War III starts.
Whew. Thank you very much. The very last question for you tonight. I'm sure you must have known that I was going to ask you this. It comes from Lazar from Belgrade, who was present in 2016 in the auditorium when you predicted the victory of Donald Trump. So Lazar asks you, who will win in November, Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
Well, you're assuming, Lazar, that they're both still alive in November. These are men in their 70s who are, by the nature of their profession, quite likely to be exposed at some point to COVID-19. So I think one has to just bear in mind that there is a scenario in which by November the 3rd, neither of them is actually available to contest the election. In that scenario, and of course a lot would depend on timing, we might find Mike Pence pitted against Bernie Sanders. And in that kind of an election, it's really hard to be sure who would win. My basic view here is that the Democratic candidate should win this election, regardless of who it is. Because by the time we get to November the 3rd, not only will the economy be in as depressed a state as it's been at any point in the lifetime of even the oldest voter, but also the pandemic will not be gone. And the full extent of the disruption, I think, will be really depressing to people. I think morale will be heavily sapped if there's a second wave, particularly if it feels as if the government really doesn't have a handle on it. And so it's very difficult for an incumbent to win in a recession, particularly if questions are being asked about the competence of that president's performance in the preceding year. So I'd be inclined to say that the Democratic candidate, whoever it is going to win, and Donald Trump will be a one-term president. It was great fun having a reality TV guy as president, as long as nothing went wrong. And I think a great many people derived satisfaction from the sense that they'd elected a disruptor as president to shake up the system. But as soon as the system actually had to cope with a crisis, it became very clear that he was chronically incompetent. And I think that ultimately sinks him, even with the best digital campaign that Brad Parscale can run on Facebook. So yeah, I'm afraid whether it's Biden, Sanders, Kamala Harris, because of course Biden will at some point nominate a running mate, my money's on the Democrat. But it'll be close. And let me add a final reflection. It could be very close under these circumstances. Imagine the election of 2000 with a margin that's wafer thin, contingent on the results in one state. Then it was Florida. I can't envisage a scenario in which there's a kind of gentlemanly compromise under conditions of a contested result. And that's a scary prospect. The United States, confronted by an inconclusive result, with each side crying foul and alleging, no doubt, Russian and Chinese interference, That's a nightmare scenario. So, frankly, I'm just hopeful that there is a decisive result one way or the other, because the worst case scenario would be a draw.
Thank you very much, Niall. This was one of the best conversations that we had since the onset of CEST. I'm prepared to say that. I very much hope that we are going to have you again in Belgrade for the second volume of Kissinger's biography, if not earlier. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much for taking the time. And let's hope to see each other soon, somewhere in the world after the world returns back to some kind of normal. Thank you.
Well, Vuk, it's been a pleasure talking to you. As the Queen said in one of her recent addresses to the nation, we'll meet again. She forgot to add the later lines of that famous song, don't know where, don't know when. But let me just conclude by wishing you a very happy wedding anniversary, and congratulations to your daughter whose birthday is today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nell. And all the best to your family as well. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Vuk. Bye.
Thank you.